Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for just this time together today. I thank you for these great leaders and the incredible work that you are doing through them. Father, I just pray that you would speak to us today, speak through Jackie in a special way, encourage us today, challenge us today, and just lead us and guide us in our next steps as leaders and as Christian organizations through this time today. We commit it to you, and we thank you for just being able to be together for a few minutes today and learn together. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Jackie, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me today. So my name is Jackie McLaughlin. I am a CPA, but hopefully that won't scare you away by the time I get done with this. I pride myself on not using all that CPA language that no one likes but us. So we'll leave all of that language out of today's presentation. I've been a CPA since, as I like to say, since the earth cooled, and particularly in the nonprofit arena for round numbers, about 20 years. Right now, I work for Chazin Company, as I said, which is an outsourced financial solutions company. So that said, let's jump into the roles of a treasurer. But actually, where I like to start, and I didn't make a slide on this one, I should have, is to dispel the one big myth about being a treasurer. And that myth is you have to be an accountant or a CPA to be a treasurer. You don't. You don't have to be an accountant or a CPA. And I say that because in today's competitive marketplace, it's very difficult anymore for nonprofits to find treasurers, frankly, for two reasons. One, people would rather talk about the mission. That is far more fun than talking about the accounting behind the mission. And then two, people would rather talk about the fundraising part of it, which sustains the mission. So nobody really likes to talk about the accounting and the numbers. And so it is difficult to find a treasurer. You don't need an accountant or CPA. You just need somebody with common sense. And we're going to get into how important common sense is as we go through the responsibilities of a treasurer. And actually, some of these responsibilities are more than those of just the treasurer, particularly this first item we're going to cover, fiduciary responsibility. That's something that any board member has, as well as, and I'm going to use the initials today, ED, which I use to abbreviate executive director. And kind of in the world of Chazin Company's clients, you might be an executive director, you might be called president, but essentially the responsibilities, regardless of your title, is the same. So I'm just going to use ED, executive director, just to abbreviate it. The responsibilities of a treasurer are fiduciary, budget, transparency and accountability, financial decision-making, risk management, and financial reporting. We're going to spend a lot of time on fiduciary, or more time than the other subjects, because fiduciary drives everything else. So I promised you I wouldn't use accounting jargon today, but I am using legal jargon. And that's the slide you see up here now. But don't worry, we're going to read the legal jargon, and then I will use words that I can understand anyway, unlike these words. So executive directors and board members are fiduciaries who steer the organization towards a sustainable future by adopting sound ethical and legal governance and financial management policies, as well as by making sure the nonprofit has adequate resources to advance its mission. And again, if that's confusing to you, like it is to me, we're going to break it down in just a second. So how to protect yourself when you have fiduciary responsibility, and you protect yourself with knowledge. We're also going to talk about how you protect your organization when you have fiduciary responsibility. But for now, we're going to start with yourself, and you do that with knowledge. You have legal responsibilities as a fiduciary. And again, if you're a board member, regardless of whether you're a treasurer or on the board, this applies to you. If you're an executive director, this applies to you. If you are a C-suite level person in a nonprofit, this applies to you. So you've more than three, but these are the three primary legal responsibilities. A duty of care, which means you have to make prudent use of all assets, exercise oversight to ensure effectiveness and sustainability, and act with a greater degree of care than you might give your own affairs. You have a duty of loyalty, which means you need to make decisions in the best interest of the organization. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. And you have a duty of obedience, which means you have to ensure that the activities you engage in advance the mission and adhere to the organization's purpose. And you also need to make sure that your organization is following the applicable laws and ethical standards. So let's get out of all the legal talk and talk about what that really means. And the analogy that I've stumbled on that works really well, because it's very true, is fiduciary responsibility is like being a parent. If you are a parent or no parents, you know what fiduciary responsibility is, because as a parent, you are making every single decision you make in the best interest of your children. So you may have an opportunity for a fantastic job across the country. Once you have children, you don't just take that job. You sit and think about the impact that moving your child across the country is going to have on him or her. My own example, I had an opportunity to move across the country when my son was in high school. And as a good fiduciary, i.e. parent, I made the decision to not take that opportunity and stay where I was so that he could stay in the high school that he was used to. You also do fiduciary things for your children every single day. If you want to take a fabulous trip to Europe and that trip is going to cost you $10,000, but that means your children go without food for a year, you're not going to go on that trip to Europe and you're going to feed your children. So as a parent, you don't think about yourself. You're thinking about your child first. As a fiduciary, you shouldn't be thinking about yourself. You should be thinking about your organization first. A couple of points to expand on this. This is something I talk about very, very frequently because no one understands fiduciary responsibility. When you throw that word out, people's eyes glass over. They don't know what the heck you're talking about. So I find that using that parenting example is something we can all relate to and get our arms around. I did have a very wise ED, though, push back on me one time because it was particularly targeted to board members. And they said, wait a minute, it sounds like you think the board should treat the executive director or the organization like children and parent them like children. And frankly, normally I don't think that fast on my feet, but I came back with, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying children have two parents and each parent has a role in their life. So similarly, an entity has two parents, the management and the board, and each parent has a role in that entity's life. So board members should be up at a high level, strategically thinking. One thing that they can do very effectively, going to the duty of obedience, is they can help the executive director stay on track. And what I mean by that is executive directors, everyone I've ever met, is very, very passionate about their mission. And so perhaps their mission is feeding homeless people, and they get very passionate. They come to a board meeting one day and they say, these people need housing. We're going to get them housing too. That's when the board steps in and says, wait. Our mission is to feed homeless people, not house them. We have to stay on our mission. So the day-to-day decisions are absolutely being made by the management of the entity. but the board is kind of there as a guiding light, making sure that the passion doesn't take them in a direction that although good, it's great to house homeless people. That's not the mission of my example organization that feeds homeless people. Another example of the duty of loyalty, I'm going to give you two real examples from my life. I'm going to give you a good example and a bad example. So a good example is we have a client right now, and they're in a highly populated urban area, and they have to pay for parking, as you often do in urban areas. So they needed a new parking contract, and they have a board member who has parking lots, and one of the parking lots was right close to their property. So the board member said, well, hey, I'll do a parking contract for you, and it will be about $14,000 a month, which some of you may go, oh my gosh, that's so expensive. But it was a heck of a lot of parking spaces in a highly dense urban environment. So it wasn't. But here's the key to this whole story. Because he was a good fiduciary, this particular board member, he said, I'll tell you what, I have this parking lot that you can rent spaces from me for $14,000 a month. He said, but why don't you have your staff go get other bids for this for parking in this area, that many spots and that much parking. And let's see where my offer falls with respect to my competitors' offers. So the staff did that. They went out and they got bids, and they came to a board meeting, because this could border on conflict of interest, which we're going to talk about later. They took it to a board meeting and they laid it out to the board. Hey, board member XYZ is parking lots, $14,000 a month. We did a market study. Here's what the competitors are charging, which were $14,000+ a month. We need to make a decision about this parking contract. And this is key to the whole story. The board member with the parking lot then recused himself. He left the room, and the board took a vote. And obviously, I mean, he was competitive with his offer. The board voted to give him the parking contract. But the two keys to that story was that the organization got competitive bids. The board voted while the board member with the parking lot was out of the room. So he was not a part of the vote at all. That's a good story. Now, the bad story. The bad story is that I was a CFO of a small private nonprofit college. And one of the board members was a certified financial planner. And he came in my office one day and he threw down a stack of papers, and he told me that we were going to invest some of our money in a certain investment, and he wanted me to sign the papers. He didn't explain any of this to me. He just came in with a stack of papers demanding that I sign these papers. Accountants are not financial investment experts, but I knew enough to know this was not a good investment. It wasn't a good investment for the college. It was a good investment for this board member, because the commissions it paid was a lot greater than any other type of investment out there. So he violated a whole ton of rules and fiduciary responsibility, because, first of all, there is an investment committee that's a subsection of the board that's tasked with determining where the organization is going to invest. Secondly, he came into my office and just demanded that I sign these papers. And I wouldn't sign the papers. And I told him, you know, he had to take this to the investment committee and do it properly. And he spent about a month coming into my office at least once a week, trying to bully me into signing the papers. I never signed them. He was forced to take them to the investment committee, who then, because he was forced to do that, went through the proper vote. And in the end, the investment committee decided not to give him the contract because it wasn't in the best interest of the college's money. So that's a bad example of somebody who wasn't having fiduciary responsibility. He was trying to push the organization into investing in this particular way, because it benefited him, not the organization. So one of the things that people don't realize is that as a fiduciary, you do have some legal liabilities. The risk is that you can be held liable for damages caused by your wrongful acts, and I want to emphasize the word wrongful acts or omissions. Your best defense, or how to be proactive, is to understand your responsibilities as an officer and ensure that your organization follows the law and its bylaws. The insurance is that there is insurance out there, which you commonly hear as D&O, and that stands for Directors and Officers Insurance. So there is insurance out there that can help you with this risk. And before I go any further, Heather, are there any questions before I move on?
Doing great, Jackie. No, and it's very helpful to give your examples. No questions yet, but feel free as things come up. If you have a question, put it in the chat.
So another way to reduce your risk, and I didn't come up with this on purpose, but I kind of like it, busy. If you look at the words in the red there, B-U-S-E, busy, is to be familiar with your nonprofit's financials. Now, again, this part of the training isn't unique to treasurers. It's board training, it's executive director training. It covers all the above. So be familiar with your organization's financial statements, and we're going to talk about that later. Understand the internal controls in your organization. We're going to talk about that too. Set the proper tone at the top. If you are living up to your fiduciary responsibilities, you are setting the proper tone at the top. So again, in my parenting example, if you, and I mean, I say this kind of in a funny way, but serious too, if you don't want your children to steal, you shouldn't steal, because you as the parents set the example. If you don't steal, your children are far less likely to steal. So that's what tone at the top is. You as a board member, you as a treasurer, you as an executive director, you are setting the tone at the top and letting everybody else know what you're going to tolerate and what you're not going to tolerate. Example, when I was an auditor with a CPA firm, we had a partner in our firm, a partner, that's, top of the heap, cream of the crop. And he wasn't independent from his clients in all cases. And that's critical for auditors. You have to audit with professional skepticism and be very independent and look at the facts. He wasn't. And he did some questionable things. And one of the staff members, who was 2 years out of college, was able to go to another partner in the firm and say, this makes me uncomfortable, what he is doing, what this partner A is doing. So that firm had such an environment of integrity and proper tone at the top and good ethics that partner B, who was the managing partner, if any of you are familiar with the terminology, actually launched an investigation into partner A to gather the facts, determine if his business practices were questionable. And in fact, ultimately, he was asked to resign. So that's an extreme example at tone at the top. But when you are 2 years out of college and you can go to a partner and say, I'm really uncomfortable with what this other partner is asking me to do, and it gets traction, people take you seriously and they look into it and come to a well-informed conclusion, suddenly your firm is saying, I don't stand for any funny business. We're going to have integrity, we're going to have ethics, and it's starting at the top and it's flowing down. And it's up to you and your board to exhibit that and show everybody through your actions and your decisions that you're going to be ethical and have integrity. And then the E in my busy mnemonic here is ensure that no single person has too much power or control over the financial transactions. That's part of that internal controls under the U that we're going to talk more about. Interesting.
Jackie?
Mhm.
Sorry, you had when you brought up the whole idea of the D&O insurance, there was a question that came up just asking in terms of, do you know what a ballpark amount that a smaller organization would expect to pay, or what they, some other details on that expectation for D&O insurance? Can you elaborate on that?
From what I remember, it for a small organization, it's going to be under $5,000 a year.
Thank you.
It's not cost prohibitive at all.
Thanks.
So interesting statistic here that I have in the parentheses is that there is an organization that does what they call it the Report to the Nations, and their 2024 Report to the Nations just came out, and they study fraud globally, every single country, and they compile all these statistics. And I put this statistic in here on purpose. It comes from the 2024 Report to the Nations that nonprofits account for 10% of reported fraud worldwide, 10% of fraud cases. Now, I couldn't find more current data in the US, but in 2017, so 7 years ago, nonprofits were 3% of all businesses in the US, but they account for 10% of worldwide fraud. And I bring that up because one of the mistakes that nonprofits can make is you're so passionate about your mission and you believe everybody else is too, and it never enters your mind that somebody might steal from the organization or do nefarious things. And I'm not saying that you should live every day thinking people are out there trying to steal from you, but I am saying that you should put good processes in place so that it makes it less likely. So here's another example from an organization I worked for. It was a very small organization. I was the only accountant there. And so I put the money in the bank, I paid the bills, I did the bank rec, which is not good internal controls, but sometimes budgets prohibit you from having more people to do these different transactions. So anyway, when I started day one, the president said, I'm going to get you a company credit card. And I said, please don't. And she said, why? And I said, I would rather put any company expenses on my own credit card and submit them to you for reimbursement. And she said, well, that's just crazy. We'll get you a company credit card. And I said, I really don't want it, because by not having a company credit card, it's better internal controls, but also for me, that means nobody can ever point a finger at me that I'm charging inappropriate things on a company credit card. No one can, because I don't have it. Charging it on my own, and you, Ms. President, are approving what I charge. So I can't ever be accused, and I like that for me. It's also better for the organization. So one of your responsibilities as a treasurer is a budget. And everybody's eyes glaze over when we talk about budgets, because everyone hates budget. I am going to ask you to reframe your opinion about a budget. I call a budget a guidepost. So one of the things, I'm going to go off on a little tangent, but I'll put a bow around it. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is this idea of decision fatigue. And all of you, if you're executive directors or decision makers in a nonprofit, I know you know what I'm talking about. I mean, by the end of the day, I can't even decide what I want to have for dinner because I've been making so many decisions during the day and I'm fatigued. So my goal in my work life right now is to create routines and habits as much as I possibly can so that I can take decisions off my plate and reduce the opportunity for decision fatigue. So how does that relate to the budget? Because the budget is those routines and habits you can set up ahead of time to reduce your decision fatigue. And here's what I mean by that. So first, a good budgeting process should start with your staff. And that's because you should be holding your staff accountable for their budget. So what I mean by that is if you have advancement, fundraising, whatever you might call that department, you have somebody who heads up that department. That person should create their own budget for the upcoming year. I'm not saying that you're going to accept that budget, but it should start with that person who heads up fundraising. Similarly, if going back to my homeless example, if your organization feeds the homeless and you have somebody in charge of those programs, that person should create their budget. All of these different budget managers will create their budgets, and that's very, very important because when you get them to help create the budget, you're getting them to buy into the budget that they are ultimately going to be held accountable for. It comes in usually to a finance person in your organization who will compile all the different departmental budgets into an overall organization entity-wide budget. If your organization is like every single other one I've ever seen in all my experience on this earth, it's going to come in at a deficit, at a negative number, which means it needs work. So off on a tangent again, another myth. We talked about the first myth, treasurers have to be accountants. Here's another myth. Nonprofits aren't allowed to make a profit. Yes, they are. And if you want to sustain yourself for years to come, you have to make a profit to generate the cash to continue to sustain yourself. So your budget, when it's first compiled from all the budget managers, will probably come in at a deficit because your budget managers are asking for the moon, as well they should. Because if they don't ask for the moon, they're going to get less than less. So they ask for the moon, you compile it, you find a deficit. And then if you're an executive director, you have to work with your finance person and each budget manager to start cutting expenses and or increasing revenue, either way. You want to get to at least a break even, preferably a positive number. This process can be long and involved depending on the size of your organization, and that's why everyone hates it, everyone. And what we often see is because people hate it so much, they just kind of throw some numbers together and say, this looks good, let's go with it. But short-term pain for long-term gain, and I'm going to explain the long-term gain in a minute. Once the executive director buys off on it, then it will typically go to the treasurer who usually, and the finance committee. And usually the treasurer kind of heads up the finance committee, but it will go to that person and that committee. And the committee will take a deep dive into the budget and start asking questions. What are the assumptions on this revenue growth? How do you plan on getting there? Why did the salary line increase 150% from last year? They'll take a deep dive and ask a lot of questions to make sure that the budget makes sense. Once your finance committee approves the budget, then it will usually go to the full board to get approved. And usually, in my experience, the full board is very reliant on the finance committee and will pretty much vote whatever way the finance committee recommends that they vote, because the full board is trusting the finance committee to have done the deep dive. But once your budget's approved, this is your long-term gain to it. Because now, as you're going through the course of your year and your staff comes up with great ideas or different things that they want to do, it takes away a lot of decisions for you. Is it in the budget? That's your only question. If it's not in the budget, whatever great idea they want to execute isn't something you should do this year. That's not to say you can't look at it for next year, but if it's not in the budget, don't do it. So you're making less decisions, and it's helping to reduce that decision fatigue. But before that upsets you, what I just said, what do you mean? It's a great idea. We want to do it. I'm sure it's a great idea, but your organization probably has a 5-year strategic plan. That's usually what I see. And so before your budget is even started, there's usually a conversation at a higher level that goes something like this. Well, here's our 5-year strategic plan. What part of that are we going to execute this year? So if your 5-year strategic plan is A, B, C, D, E, and by the way, you don't have to go in order. Your organization may say, we want to execute C this year. If that's the part of the strategic plan you want to execute this year, that's what you budget around. So when your staff comes to you with these great ideas that maybe support D as in dog for your strategic plan, if you've budgeted for C, your answer is that's not budgeted for this year, but we can take a look at it for next year. So it just removes decisions from you. Kind of like eating healthy. I don't know about all of you. I hate broccoli. I just hate it. But short-term pain for long-term gain. If I eat my broccoli, I'm going to be a lot healthier when I go to my physician's visit once a year, and I'm not going to listen to his lecture about my eating habits. So short-term gain, long-term pain. Or no, short-term pain, long-term gain. And this is the same thing I just said. Oh, no, there's a little bit more. So the first 3 are what I just talked about. The budget should be created every year with input from budget managers, consistent with the strategic plan and approved by the board. Here's the new data from this slide, and this is so important. Every single month, you should measure your actual performance against your budget. And we call that a budget to actual report. You should get that every single month. And I'm very passionate about every single month, because just like my eating broccoli, I might get off course one month and eat too many hot fudge sundaes and not enough broccoli. Well, if I'm reviewing in some way, whether it's a food diary or a scale or whatever it is, and I can see I've had too many hot fudge sundaes, I can course correct. But if I wait 8 months before looking at something like that, it's never too late to course correct, but certainly for that year, it's too late to course correct.
Oh,
so you want to see a budget versus actual every single month. And here's the important part. Investigate large variances, either positive or negative. And people kind of look shocked when I say investigate positive variances. So what's a positive variance? You budgeted that you're going to bring in $20,000 this month in revenue, and you brought in $50,000 a month in revenue this month. That's a positive variance. A negative variance would be if you brought in $10,000 this month. Similarly, on the expense side, a positive variance is when you budgeted to spend $8,000 this month and you only spent $5,000. That's a positive variance. Negative variance is you budgeted to spend $8,000 this month, you spent $12,000. That's a negative. So it's important to look at positive variances as much as negative, because here's what I like about positive variances. What did we do right? What was it that we did right that caused this positive variance? And how can we do more of that? And this is where you really hold your budget managers accountable, and you're helping to set the tone at the top. Because when you, as a leader, are looking into the variances, you're asking the questions of the people responsible for that area and holding them accountable for both their good variances and their bad variances. And as a treasurer, This is super critical because as a treasurer, you're the only one who's going to hold the executive director responsible. So what do I mean by that? If an organization budgeted $100 in office supplies and they spent 120, nobody cares. Nobody should be looking into that variance. But if they budgeted to spend $100 in office supplies and they spent $10,000 in office supplies, somebody should be looking into that variance. What the heck happened? Maybe something very logical happened, or maybe they're just not keeping their eye on the ball. Either way.
Jackie, you're hitting something really, I think, vital in the area of where boards and staff working together, and setting that tone at the top. When you look at the idea of measuring and providing those reports and doing the investigation on the variance, who do you see doing this? Is, whose role, when does it happen? And, when should it not happen? Maybe even.
Thank you. Love that question. So it absolutely should be monthly. So you have time to course correct. It starts with the staff. It starts with the budget managers getting the budget to actual report for their particular area. And they better be asking those questions. Now, a budget manager might be looking into a variance that, I'm making this up, each organization would be different, that maybe has a 5% difference. A budget manager would be looking at those 5% differences. The executive director is looking at the individual budget manager's variances, and they're maybe looking at variances that are 10% different. But the executive director isn't doing the deep dive into why was this variance caused. The budget manager is doing that deep dive, and better be prepared. So when the executive director says, why did you go $10,000 over in office supplies? The budget manager better be able to give a good reason or say, we got off course. Here's the plan to correct it going forward. But then, Heather, back to your real question, the treasurer then, yes, the treasurer should also get those budget to actual reports a lot more summarized. The treasurer doesn't need to see hotel, airfare, mileage, rental cars. The treasurer might just see travel with it all rolled up into travel. And the treasurer might be focused on variances that are 40, again, I'm making up these percentages, but 40 to 50% off course. So the treasurer should absolutely fly at a higher level than the executive director does. But if the process has worked all along the way from the budget manager to the executive director, when the treasurer is asking these questions, the executive director's already got the answers. I've also seen it and practiced this in my own life, where when I give a treasurer budget variance report, that's another name for it, budget variance, I'll give that person explanations immediately. So if you can visualize an Excel spreadsheet with budget, with actual, with the variance, and then I'll have a whole column that's nothing but my notes about what happened to why they had this variant. Oh my gosh. Hi, Jody. Sorry. Jody and I go back a little ways. So I'll give them, a whole column that has explanations for some of the larger variances. But it's critically important that the treasurer take a look at these variances because, again, executive directors can get so passionate about their mission. And now that I see Jody on the call, she's very passionate about her mission. So they can get so passionate about the mission that sometimes you need that treasurer to go, hey, I appreciate your passion, but what happened here? We went $300,000 over budget. And by the way, that's not a real Jody example. Only Jody example is passion.
Love it. Yeah, I appreciate that because I think, in a well-developed, perfect world, everybody is working on that at every level. I think there's many times where, like you're talking about the tone at the top, that sometimes it's going to be the finance committee, the treasurer's role to set that tone to say, we want to explanation for these variances. And it's
Yes.
possible that's not happening yet. Or vice versa, the board may not be asking that, but not necessarily getting that in board meetings where it gets bogged down into the details, but at least at that treasurer pre-board. I think that's one thing I've seen and heard people wrestling with, when, who, when should this be done, so that our board meetings don't get bogged down and people start to overcompensate and micromanage. So you clearly answered that. That was helpful. Thank you.
And
Well,
one step
and-
further, Heather, because this is a really good point. Usually then the treasurer will report to the whole board. And so that summarized version that the treasurer gets usually is summarized even more for the whole board. And that level of variance is even greater than it was at the if it's 40% at the treasurer level, maybe it's, I don't know, 60% at the whole board level, whatever it is. And usually then, the treasurer is basically just speaking to the variance and saying, this is the plan the course correction plan going forward. And it's kept a very high level. But also to your point, Heather, another real life example, I worked for an organization that was not doing well financially for multiple years in a row. And the financial presentation at the board meetings was always the very last thing to be done. And this organization had been around for so long that they just thought that nothing could ever happen to them, but it was. Their reserves were eroded away year after year after year. And so finally, a treasurer stepped up and said, no, we have to do the financials first thing on the agenda every single board meeting. We can't bury it till the end. People are tired, they're not paying attention. It's got to be front and center. And so they did. They changed the process. And I'm not saying that the financial report was 45 minutes long. It was 5 or 10 minutes max. But just by moving it to the top of the agenda, it changed the whole trajectory of the finances for the organization. And they turned around their losses, or multi-year losses.
Jackie, I was just going to say, anytime a finance person starts a conversation with, I appreciate your passion, but then you're going to have a money discussion.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And by the way, I do this in my personal life. We all do. I get very passionate about something and I don't know, it's a flower. I want to buy up all these flowers in the world and put them in my yard, but my budget only lets me buy so many of those flowers. Okay, treasurer also is responsible for transparency and accountability. So this one, because I'm running out of time here. So this one is going to be quick, because typically as a nonprofit, that means either two things or one of two things. So first of all, you all probably have a charitable solicitation license that is issued by the state that you're in. The charitable solicitation license will dictate when you have to have an audit or when you can have a review, which is a little bit of a step down audit and a lot less expensive. So your charitable solicitation license will dictate that audit requirement. But regardless of whether you have an audit requirement or not, you do have to file taxes. Even though you're a nonprofit, you have to file a tax return unless you're a church. And there's a few other rare exceptions. That tax return is largely informational in nature. It's very, very long. You need a professional to do it. But here's what some people don't realize either. The treasurer of the finance committee, and the full board have to review and approve both the audit and the tax return. So again, as treasurer, we're looking at you. Usually the board relies on the treasurer to deep dive into the audit and to deep dive into the tax return. And if the treasurer recommends that it's approved, then generally the full board will recommend it's approved. And this is critical because your 990 is a matter of public record. So there are websites out there that I can go to right this second and put in the name of, I'm gonna pick on Jody again because I see her and love her to death. I can put in the Bridge Home in this particular website and it will give me a list of all the 990s, the Bridge Home, which is the tax return. The Bridge Home is filed and I can deep dive into her tax returns and look at them. As a nonprofit, your audit also has to be a matter of public record. And I see this done in one of two ways. Some organizations will put it right on their website. Other organizations will say provided upon request. So just depending on what you want to do. But here is, as the treasurer, the key things you have to look for in either an audit and or the tax return. Categories, and I broke them out here: program, G&A, and fundraising. So your finance people and your auditors will break all of your expenses into one of these three categories. And I will give you a true story as to why this is true. So let me deep dive a little bit on that. They'll break down all of your expenses, which means if you have travel expenses, they're going to slot travel expenses in program, G&A, and fund and or fundraising. So for simple math in my head, if you have $15,000 a year in travel expenses, your accountant's going to go, how much of that money was used by the people who feed the homeless and have to go out in their cars and drive and provide food, or sorry, Jody, to keep picking on you, but you're right on my screen. Jody's organization shelters homeless. And so oftentimes she's got, I wouldn't call it travel, but she's got moteling expenses to help shelter homeless people. So her accountants will take, let's call it lodging, and the lodging that she pays for to shelter homeless people is program. That's what she's in business to do, is shelter people. If I work for Jody and I'm her accountant and I take a trip to get some training or something, I say, hey, Jody, there's this great conference I want to go to. And Jody says, yeah, go. My travel lodging will be coded to G&A, general and administrative. If Jody well, she does. If Jody's fundraising people come to her and say, hey, Jody, I want to go to this fundraising event that's 5-hour drive away, but it's going to be great. I can meet a lot of new donors. And Jody says, this is a great idea. And it's in the budget. Go ahead and do it. So that lodging would be in the fundraising category. So $15,000 a year in travel could be broken down between each of these categories, depending on who traveled and why. This is important because of this very true story. I'm dating myself, 80s or 90s, can't remember the decade. It was either Red Cross, United Way, again, can't remember which one. But they were spending an inordinate amount of every dollar contributed on overhead, keeping the lights on, rent, salaries, the CEO's bonus, that kind of stuff. It came out in the press. Somehow the press got a hold of this, and the press went crazy with it, because I'll tell you myself, if I donate to the Red Cross, I want my money going to Hurricane Katrina victims or whatever. I don't want my money paying the CEO's bonus. As a reasonable person, I understand that part of every dollar I donate will pay the CEO's bonus because you have to keep your overhead going. But I would hope that most of my dollar goes to help the Katrina victims or whoever. So when it came out in the press that one of those two organizations was spending a ridiculous amount of money, I'm exaggerating, I don't remember the number, but call it 90 cents on the dollar, supporting their overhead, their donors and supporters went crazy in a bad way, as they should have. So as a result of all that, a couple things happened. A, the organization completely cleaned things up. So they're all a reputable, wonderful organization now. No bad will towards whichever one it was. They've cleaned it up. But secondly, as accountants, we changed the way we do business. And we said, you know what? What's really important to donors, grantors, lenders is how much of the expenses are program, how much is general administrative, how much is fundraising. And the credit ranking agencies will use this to help rank how good your charity is. And donors will go to Charity Navigator type places to figure out if your nonprofit is a good one to donate to. So typically, donors like to see, or the ranking services like to see, about $7.70 out of every dollar a donor gives goes to a program expense. But I did have this question. Somebody in one of these presentations I did before said, Jackie, what's the target for program expenses? And I said, the target is the truth. That's the target. You have to tell the truth. But that said, people like, sorry, Jody, I keep picking on you. I'm so sorry. But people like Jody, who's an executive director, I'm making this up. I don't remember how much Jody makes. I don't know. It's completely made up for easy math in my head. If Jody makes, let's say, $100,000 a year, and she determines, because I know Jody, she spends time in helping the homeless, she spends time in raising money, and she spends time in managing her staff. So she spends time in all three of these categories: program, G&A, and fundraising. For simple math in my head, if Jody makes $100,000 a year, and she estimates reasonably that 60% of her time is spent working with the homeless, we can take $60,000 of her salary and code it to program expenses. And then we'll code the other two as she gives us feedback on that. So there's no target category. The target category is the truth. But what a lot of nonprofits don't think about is somebody like Jody, they might have just put her whole $100,000 in salary to general and administrative. She's the executive director. We're throwing it all in general and administrative. No, you don't have to do that. I've seen Jody work. This woman spends a lot of time working with homeless people. So you can break out that time into the program expenses. Any questions, Heather, before I move to financial decision making?
So sorry, I was muted. Yeah, there's just a lot of good conversation in the chat, really, about audits. I think some groups are small enough where they aren't mandated to do audits, so this is new, even ideas for them. So we're going to do some follow-up on that, and I'm also recommending people check in with Chazin to just do that time with Karen and find out some details that might fit their organization.
And Heather, is it true I've got 4 minutes?
No, you have until quarter after. We have a
Oh, okay.
75-minute. You're
Okay.
actually better off than you thought. Good
Yeah,
job.
good. Okay.
You're good.
So the treasurer also helps the board with financial decision making, and the most obvious time that they do this is during the budget approval process, because I mentioned earlier that it's the board's expectation that the treasurer and the finance committee have done that deep dive into the budget. So typically by the time the budget is presented to the board, it's kind of like, here it is, we're budgeted to break even, or we're going to make $10,000 this year. Usually the board will ask a few high level questions, and then because the treasurer is recommending it be approved, the board will approve it. The other area where the treasurer can help in financial decision making is when the executive director has to go off budget. So I just spent a lot of time telling you all the reasons why budgets are good things and they're a guidepost and you got to stick to them. And I stick to what I said. However, again, in Jody's situation, she has, her organization has buildings that, I don't know what else to call it, that have apartments or rooms for homeless people. So at some point in time, I promise you this, the HVAC in one of her buildings is going to go out, and it's going to be at a time when she hasn't anticipated it's going to happen. And she's going to be looking down the barrel of a $40,000 cost or whatever it is that she hadn't budgeted for. So she's going to, go through her tenure as ED and largely follow her budget. But as much as she tries to follow it, she's going to get obstacles put in her way. And that's going to be when her HVAC goes out at the absolute worst time. So because she's spending, I don't know what I just said, I'm going to say $50,000 for round numbers in my head, because she's got to spend an extra $50 getting this HVAC repaired and it's going off budget, she's going to have to go to the board and ask them to approve this off-budget expenditure. But she's going to have to go to the treasurer first, because the board is going to rely on the treasurer to help them make that decision. And typically what the treasurer is going to say is, totally get it, Jody, we got to replace that HVAC. Where are we going to save on budget in other areas so that we can pay for this? So as an executive director, when you're going to your treasurer because you got to replace your HVAC and you weren't planning on it, go to that person prepared with where the money's going to come from. You're going to cancel all travel this year for your staff or whatever it may be. But go with solutions, because your treasurer will ask where the money is going to come from.
Well, and Jackie, that factors into fundraising, right? So if you've got some challenges coming up and those can be anticipated, and the board treasurer gives insight into what's coming down the line, yeah, you've got to make decisions on where that money's going to come from, either cutbacks or adjustments to the budget, or increased fundraising and trying to figure out how to raise that money for sure. But to your point, knowing about it in advance is significant. It gives you time to figure out what the solution can be.
Absolutely. The other thing is, you don't want to go to your treasurer when you're going to go $500 over budget. That's so generally, and this goes back to your comment earlier, Heather, kind of in line with your comment about budget variances. You're not going to go to the treasurer when you're $500 over budget on some expense. You'll set a threshold, and your treasurer together, you know, back to the mom and dad thing, or the two parents in the home, you'll set a threshold over which budget overages or the HVAC issue has to go to the treasurer before the money is spent. So part of your fiduciary responsibility, and as a treasurer, is how to protect your nonprofit, and you protect your nonprofit with policies and procedures. So I talked to you earlier about internal controls, and I told you we would talk about that more later on, and now it's later. So one example of internal controls is the example I gave you of me when the president wanted to give me a corporate credit card, and I said, no, I don't want a corporate credit card. So again, you're going to hear tone at the top all throughout our time together, because I just can't preach it enough, but that starts good internal controls at tone at the top. And you're going to ensure that no single person has too much power or control over the financial transactions. So let's go back to me, because who doesn't love to talk about me? When I was in that role where they wanted to give me the credit card, and I said no, I was the only person in that role. So I did have all the power and control over financial transactions. It couldn't be helped. We weren't large enough to hire other people so we could split those duties. But so we put what accountants, sorry, I'm going to use an accounting word, likes to call mitigating controls. We put mitigating controls in place, which is part of this I for implement checks and balances. So for example, when the bank statement came in the back, this is back when they mailed things, the president got it first before I did. So the president could scan it and see if there was any funny business going on in it. Then I would reconcile the bank statement and give the reconciliation and the statement back to the president, who would review it. And back in those days, you initialed things to show that you reviewed it. Again, any checks written to me were signed off by the president, not only to approve the checks written to me, but I had check signing authority. But when checks were written to me, they had to have the president's signature on it. And because we set up that internal control, the auditors audited for that. They would ensure that my checks were only signed by the president. Nowadays, you have automatic bill paying options, which allow you to automatically set up procedures that if I was working for one of you and a bill pay was going to me, one of you would have to approve it, or no money is going out the door. So even though I was the only one and it became impossible to segregate duties because it was just me, we could put checks and balances in around me, which would have made it very difficult. If I was a criminal, it would have made it very difficult for me to commit any crimes there. Easy thing all of you can do is offer an online payment portal for any donors who want to make contributions. And that's a super easy internal control, because typically that money goes directly from your merchant processor right into your bank account without being touched by human hands. And you can offer ACH payments. You can offer some of your larger donors the ability to make ACH payments directly into your bank account so that that money does not cross human hands. And then, of course, you can outsource all or part of your accounting functions, because outsourced people don't really have what we used to call check signing authority. Usually that's a good segregation of duties, and a good outsourcer will make it darn near impossible for, no, not darn near, a good outsourcer will make it impossible for them to get into your bank account or your credit cards. And by the way, the biggest area of fraud in nonprofits is credit card theft. And what I mean by credit card theft is I've got a company credit card and I'm going to Tiffany's and buying myself a $20,000 diamond ring. So it's not that I'm stealing a credit card. I have it because the president gave it to me, but I'm using it for personal purchases. That's one of the biggest source of fraud in nonprofits. So there are some policies that you can establish that support a good tone at the top. The conflict of interest policy is the example I gave you earlier about the parking lot and the board member in the parking lot situation. You'll note here, according to that report to the nations, and if any of you want to look it up, it's produced by an organization called ACFE, which is Association or Society or something of Certified Fraud Examiners. But report to the nations. According to them, in a nonprofit, 35% of all fraud is conflict of interest. And an example was the investment advisor who had a big conflict of interest. What's also interesting is, generally speaking, fraud won't be caught in the normal course of business. Most fraud is caught through a whistleblower, and that's at 43%. So if you can, it's good to have a whistleblower policy. And a whistleblower policy usually is a mechanism that provides a phone number or email or some kind of address for way that a whistleblower can communicate with a board member. This is also something, I believe there are outsourced agencies that take whistleblower calls. So a whistleblower policy saying that it's okay to whistleblow, there won't be any retribution, we'll investigate, etc. It helps set a proper tone at the top. Your tax return will ask if you have these policies. There's a third myth number 3. People out there think that if the tax return asks, you have to have it. That is not true. The tax return asks if you have a conflict of interest and a whistleblower, but the IRS does not mandate that you have one. Now, again, your tax returns are subject to public record. So if you have potential donors or grantors or lenders even, and they look at your tax return and they see that you do have these policies, they're going to feel a little bit more warm and fuzzy inside. And finally, gift acceptance. It's not really a policy that supports proper tone at the top. It's just a good idea. It helps minimize your administrative costs. So gift acceptance policies are things that say, we're not going to accept used Hot Wheels cars. That's not something we take as a donation. Or we won't set up an endowment for $1,000 donation. To set up an endowment in your name, the minimum amount has to be $50,000 or whatever your organization decides that should be. So that's a broad brush approach to what a gift acceptance policy helps you with. And again, that helps reduce decision fatigue, because when that donor comes in with 500 old Hot Wheels cars, your advancement people can say, I love those cars. I'm sure they have fond memories for you, but I'm sorry, our gift acceptance policies doesn't allow us to take Hot Wheels cars. Treasurers are responsible for risk management. And look at what you're seeing again. Set the proper tone at the top, identify financial risks, ensure internal controls exist to mitigate fraud or financial mismanagement, and be familiar with your insurance companies. So your financial risks, I pretty much just told you, credit card fraud. The other common fraud perpetrated in nonprofit is vendor fraud. So vendor fraud is, again, if I was a criminal, I make up a fake vendor and I work for ABC Nonprofit. I make up a fake vendor. I open a bank account in my fake vendor's name. I issue a fake invoice to ABC Nonprofit, and the invoice gets approved and paid. Dating myself, back in the 90s, this was a big deal with copier toner for printers and copiers. It was a very big fraud where fraudsters, criminals would send invoices for toner cartridges that nobody ever ordered. It was all fake, because especially in big organizations, back then you always needed toner cartridges, and managers would just sign off on the bill. Yep, this is approved, and criminals got away with a lot of money doing that. It does happen in nonprofits as well, that vendor fraud. And then again, be familiar with your insurance coverages, and not only directors and officers, but they also have something called cyber coverage now that will help you if your, let's say your donor data gets stolen through a hack or that type of thing. So financial reporting, regular and timely. Ooh, I only got 5 more minutes. Okay. We touched on this earlier. The treasurer should review financials. I'm going to say quarterly. I said earlier they should be produced monthly, and they should be produced monthly. And the ED should be looking at the monthly. But the treasurer, and I say quarterly because usually that's when board meetings are. But if not quarterly, your treasurer should review financial statements before a board meeting. Treasurers, here's the big takeaway. So I love to have one thing. If you don't remember anything else I said today, remember this. This is the thing to remember. The biggest benefit that treasurers can bring to an organization is to ask questions. And I love to tell my Enron story when I talk about the importance of that. We all could talk for the next month. You'd hate it. I would love it, about what went wrong with Enron. It would bore every one of you. But if you drill down to the foundational issue of what went wrong with Enron, here's what it is. You had the geniuses in the financial industry, the #1 accounting firm in the world, and they had had that position for decades. They were doing their annual audit. They did not understand what Jeffrey Skilling was doing, nor did anybody else who worked for him other than Fastow. No one understood what they were doing. And everyone was too embarrassed to ask the question. Everyone. And I love to tell this story because the #1 accounting firm in the world at that time was Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen was the Titanic. It was never going down. And Enron took it down because the most genius minds in the accounting business who worked at Arthur Andersen were too embarrassed to say, Jeff, I don't understand what you're doing. What are you doing and why are you doing it? So as treasurers, that's the biggest benefit that you can bring to your organization, is to ask questions about things that don't look right. And the biggest problem I have with non-accountant treasurers, which is why I will lecture this all day long, is don't be afraid of looking stupid. No question is a stupid question. Absolutely no question. And if you have a bunch of finance people around your table who make you feel stupid for asking a question, get new finance people, because no question is dumb. Don't be Enron. Ask the hard questions.
Jackie, I want to sit right there for just a second, because I'm getting some indirect communication even from different ones that go, oh my gosh, I'm feeling overwhelmed. And I have so many more questions. So, this is a good awareness. If this is a first time for you, those of you that have done this for a while and you've taken some steps, you can chime in on the chat and encourage people, because it is step by step. And there is no dumb question. And at the very end, Jackie is going to offer for people to have free consultation with Chazin. So there are people out there willing to help you. And Jonathan and I are also available to field some questions, and then we'll turn over the experts, the big questions. So yeah, feel free to. I just wanted to affirm what you just said. No question's too stupid, even as an ED. Even as a board treasurer, no matter what role you have, if it's in your mind, ask it until it gets answered. It's important.
Amen, Heather. I can't second that enough. You're absolutely correct. So because Heather mentioned the overwhelm, and I get that, I'm going to forego some of the other slides because also we're running out of time and I want to be respectful. Let me try and take that overwhelm away. Here's what it's about, all of it, the rest of the slides even. It's the same thing as your personal finances. So when you are a treasurer, when you're an ED and you have fiduciary responsibility, don't get overwhelmed with everything I just said. Think about this. You probably have 3 types of accounts in your personal life. You have what I'm going to call a checking account. You pay your mortgage, your rent, your food, your utilities. You pay that out of your checking account. You have an emergency fund. If anything goes wrong, hopefully you're putting a little bit of money away every pay, even if it's $20 a pay, into your emergency fund to build that up in case your HVAC goes out. Or sometimes it's because you want to take a nice vacation. And then in your personal life, you'll have retirement savings, which is stuff you're saving, well, obviously for when you retire. So when you're in your working life, you won't touch that savings. It's all for retirement. Running a nonprofit, you have the same kind of money. There's a slightly different twist in the retirement savings bucket, but for the most part, running your nonprofit is like running your personal, the finances for your home and your family. Your nonprofit should have an account. It pays salaries and rent and so forth. It should have some emergency savings where you're saving for that rainy day when the HVAC blows up on you and you have to fix it. And then sometimes you're lucky enough that donors will give you the retirement funds. And what you think of retirement funds, kind of where my analogy loses a little bit, is the endowments, the permanently restricted money that you can never touch, but you live off the interest on it. So treat your nonprofit like you would your household. Ask questions. And those of you who are EDs here, ask questions of your budget managers. That's how you help set tone at the top when you're asking them. And that said, I am right about at time, 1 minute over. So we do have a guide that you can download, obviously for free. So I'll leave that QR code on the screen for a minute if you want to take a picture of that and download that guide. And then the next screen, we do have free consultations. We specialize only in nonprofits. We don't have any other clients who aren't nonprofits. It's all we do. And we would be more than happy to talk to any of you about any questions or confusions or needs that you might have.
Jackie, thank you so much. Yeah, please put that slide up there as well, and we'll send out that information also. Yeah, just to chime in on the overwhelmed piece again, from my standpoint, just remember, all this doesn't have to get figured out by, Thursday. And all of this information may not be right where you are right now. So I would encourage you to say, what stood out to you today? Maybe something that just was highlighted that you just feel like, you know what, we need to give that some attention, or we need to think about this. Or I love what you said at the end, Jackie, and that is the similarities between looking at the finances in your household, right? So what do we need to ask questions about? Maybe what's not right, or what do we need to plan for, or different things like that. So Jackie, I guess I didn't realize I was being a little bit of a treasurer in my own household the other day when I saw a number of Amazon charges on a credit card that I did not understand. And so I gathered the parties together and I asked them to explain those Amazon charges.
Exactly.
So anyway,
That's
I love
perfect.
I love the simplicity. I love the simplicity of that. So, well, listen, here's what we're going to do because we need to let you go. I'm going to pray for us and end our time together. And then if you would like to stay on the line for just another 5 or 6 minutes, we're going to be here with Jackie, and maybe you have a couple questions that you'd like to throw out there. So let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for, Lord, just the learning that we could do together today. This is such an important part of our work as we just want to be honorable and trustworthy and above reproach in all areas, and make sure that we're handling things and stewarding things the right way. Father, I just pray that you would continue to speak to us and just lead us and guide us in maybe a next step that needs to happen. And we just thank you for Jackie and her expertise today. And we thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.